You found it. Your home for the best content on your favorite team, the Fighting Tigers of LSU. Do us a favor. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your comments below. And be sure to smash that like button. Every Tuesday, we have the pleasure to be joined by Shea Dixon on 3 the Bengal Tiger. Good enough to be with us here. Shady, how are you, man?
I'm doing well. How are you, Matt?
Doing great. Hey, I saw Patrick Peterson was back on campus this weekend. And correct me if I'm wrong, this was like a big visitor weekend for LSU. And they had some big-name cornerbacks on campus as well. Can you walk us through, like, what role, like, why Peterson was here, what role he might have in being able to help recruit?
Yeah, look, they had double-digit official visitors. So every recruit just takes one official visit to a school, if they're one of their top teams. And to have 12 on campus at one time, that's one of the higher numbers that I've seen here recently. So of the 12, Matt, 5 of them were 5-stars, and that included those 2 corners. So Dorian Brew, whose dad, Derek Brew, ran track here at LSU, was an Olympic gold medalist back in the 90s, was on campus. Dorian was out of Conroe, Texas. And then DJ Pickett, another 5-star, the number 1 corner in the country coming out of Florida. And he's a guy, and look, Dorian Brew's a legacy, but Pickett's a guy we've talked about so often because when Corey Raymond got hired, he was already recruiting him at Florida. He's visited, I think DJ told me this was his 4th visit to LSU since Raymond got hired. So Raymond's only been here since January. That's about a visit a month, coming all the way from Florida. And just catching up with his dad last week at the On3 Elite Series. Both their dads were there at the On3 Elite Series in Nashville. And they talked about the impact Corey Raymond's had. I think that when you see Patrick Peterson come back on a weekend like this one, it speaks to a guy like Corey Raymond being here, connections you have, and then being dialed in. It's the same reason you bring a guy like Frank back and Leonard Fournette stays around the program, or Matthew, or whoever it might be. I think this was one of those things where DJ Pickett's dad has talked about. He's already had a relationship with Patrick Peterson, bouncing things off of Patrick Peterson's parents, because they were both kind of in the same spot, coming out of Florida's number 1 recruits and 5-stars and being courted by out-of-state schools like LSU. So when you've got that kind of resources in your pipeline, I think you're tapping into them as often as you can.
Shea, are there rules against I've always wondered this because I know it's been a little ambiguous. Are there rules against alums interacting with recruits?
Not on campus in those situations, which is why you've seen Joe Burrow taking photos with everybody on visits when he comes back in town for the spring game or whatever it might be. Look, over at FSU this weekend, for instance, they had former players in the NFL now. I think I saw Derwin James, may have been one of them, FaceTiming in with DBs who were on campus for a visit. So, like I said, when you've got those kind of players out there, that Justin Jefferson's making that kind of money, I would think that you would want him to be back around as often as possible.
Yeah. Do you know, was that intentional for the recruiting weekend that he was here?
I don't know. I think that I'd heard he had been around once more in the past month, so twice. So I don't know what he's got going on, but clearly he made part of it, his weekend being over there and talking with those guys. So I don't think that was probably the only reason, but yes, I think he was more than willing to help out, as evidenced by the fact that he gave $1 million, him and Tyron each, to build facilities or parts of facilities over there. So yeah, he's pretty invested both with his time and money when it comes to LSU, which, hey, look, you got a guy like in Matthew in New Orleans, you love that, right? You see a Louisiana guy doing it. A guy like Peterson, he's from South Florida. This became his new home in college, and that's what you're selling to recruits like DJ Pickett.
Shea, we spent so much of this offseason talking about the defensive line through the portal, and it's interesting as you and I have talked every week about this 2025 class. We all know it's at the top, right, with Bryce Underwood and Harlan Berry, and you got Tyler Miller. You got all these great offensive players, and I've asked several times, when are the defensive guys, elite defensive guys, going to start rolling through? Especially on the defensive line. Any updates there? How that went this weekend?
Yeah, among those double-digit visitors were a handful of defensive linemen, and I had said, we talked about this about a month ago, and I said, I think that we'll see both, because they don't have any D-line or edge commits right now, both Kevin Peoples and Brad Davis kind of get through their board and their spring evals and bring guys in on unofficial visits. And when they line up official visits, they'll really get a true feel for who they're in it with and maybe who they want to push for. And look, it took one official visit weekend for a number of On3 RPM picks to go in for LSU, predicting guys to land at LSU, or land with the Tigers, I should say. The highest rated being Damian Shanklin, the number one player out of Indiana, who's a top 100 prospect. He's a top 10 edge rusher in the country and coveted by the who's who. I mean, Ohio State is the main competition up there. Tennessee got him in, made a big splash, but the work done, and this is kind of a theme here I'll touch on with the second half of this, but the work done by Blake Baker and Kevin Peoples, and really Peoples here in this instant, recruiting edge rushers, when they were at Missouri is paying off because they were already all over him, considered he was Indiana's top prospect. You get to LSU, you continue recruiting him, and most people feel like he's LSU is in the driver's seat. And then with Bo Davis, Brandon Brown, for instance, is committed to Texas. He committed to Bo Davis, and he was in town this past weekend, and now there's kind of a feeling of, hey, look, he might flip to LSU. And he had kind of originally committed to LSU because of Bo Davis, a while back. And now that Davis is in Baton Rouge, how does that change things? Well, he makes an official visit. And then we saw, again, another guy in Xavier Akpanu coming out of Texas has put a decision date for later this month. Some feel like he will end up in LSU's class, and he was a guy he was on at Texas. And Zion Williams, who was on his official visit, a big Texas target coming out of Lufkin, made his official visit. He still has Texas visits to come, A&M, the Longhorns both will get him to campus, but July 4th he will announce. And he said that coming right off of the OV weekend. So I think there's a feeling that they made some real headway with, I'd named 3 or 4 guys right there that were in town this past weekend and could very well likely end up in this class.
Zion Williams, had to do a double take there just to make sure that you didn't say Williams' son. That would have been one hell of a coincidence if it were a Zion Williamson coming to Louisiana. But we'll follow Zion Williams. Shea Dixon on 3, the Bengal Tiger.
Made that. Yeah, I've made that mistake already. Trust me. When you write out or say that, and then people are like, "I think that you messed that up." I'm like, "Oh, I did, didn't I?" I referenced a very rich NBA player.
There's also autocorrect problems that are going to absolutely happen in my phone if Zion Williams ends up committing to LSU out of Lufkin. Shea Dixon's with us on 3, the Bengal Tiger. He's on Twitter at Shea Dixon. Now, you mentioned Justin Jefferson getting paid. That's obviously massive news. I would imagine that helps with some of the receivers. And there were 2 5-star receivers in town this weekend.
Yeah, Jamie French was once committed to Bama and then decommitted when Saban stepped down. He made his official visit. And then Khalil Lockett made his official visit coming out of Texas. Both of them are 5 stars. I spent time around both of them a week ago up in Nashville, that On3 Elite Series. And look, Lockett's the number 3 receiver in the country. French is the number 4 receiver in the country. Like, these are the who's who of guys that are out there, and they're looking at LSU very seriously. And it's, look, French's mom grew up in the Felicianas. He lives in Jacksonville, but his mom went to Southern, grew up in the Felicianas, so they have family in the area. And LSU is certainly in the kind of mix there as one of the top teams. And Lockett is an interesting one because they recruit East Texas well. He's a guy who's early on. It's kind of always been high on LSU, but it's with both those guys, I would say, too, starting to develop into, I'm looking up and seeing LSU battling Texas a lot more than I've ever seen before. And it's funny, with the move on from Saban, Bama and LSU really aren't crossing paths on a lot of guys right now, and we'll ultimately see how Bama goes about recruiting under that new regime that, obviously, at least at the top, isn't heavy on any sort of Southeast background or experience. But even A&M, it's not been a lot of LSU A&M battles. I think we're going to move forward here and talk a lot about LSU versus Texas when it comes to recruiting.
Is there any update on DeCorian Moore, Shea?
Yeah, he'll be back in town this weekend, which was new news to come out about a week ago when Moore said that Frank Wilson, Joe Sloan, Cortez Hankton, after he decommitted, said all went over to Duncanville, all sat down with him and his mom and talked things over, and he put LSU back on the list of planned visits. I think everybody thinks, okay, he's probably going to stay close to home, meaning Texas, but Oregon's in the mix. Obviously, he's been committed to LSU before. I wouldn't circle him and say he's going to end up back in the class, considering he just decommitted not very long ago, but he is no doubt in the mind of the entire industry, the number one player at receiver in the country. And all 4 of the major recruiting sites have him there. So you just keep on recruiting him. And look, you just signed Caden Durham out of Duncanville. You were in it with Colin Simmons. You recruit DeCorian Moore until the end. And one thing that I think people will come to realize over time is it's different finishing second now than it was ever before. Because when kids hit the portal, if you don't have a familiarity with them and if you don't have ties to their parents and their high school and all of that, you're behind the 8 ball. If you do, you're the team that's got a bit of an advantage. So even when it might seem like, a guy like DeCorian Moore may not end up back at LSU, if you're the staff, you have to continue to go after him.
Shea, before you go, and Shea Dixon on 3, the Bengal Tiger. Usually when you come out of big recruiting weekends, again, this is just my very novice outside looking in view, you normally pop a commit here or there. Any surprise that they didn't land a commit this weekend, or should we expect any coming soon?
I think not surprised at that because everybody that visited, and this was technically the second weekend of official visits of what would be about 6 total that kids are taking, but it was the first for LSU. So I think all 12 guys that came still have visits to come. So I didn't expect any of them would pop right away. That said, guys are setting decision dates, like I said. You look at Zion Williams, not Williamson, leading the visit and saying, hey, on July 4th, I'll announce. And Xavier Akpanu, who will be on campus later this month at D-Line, saying that he's going to announce this month. So there are guys that, yes, have dates out there. I'll also note we're in camp season, which it kind of got rained out a bit, bad O-line, D-Line only this past weekend. But when we get into those elite camps and the Friday night lights, there'll be guys on campus that get offers and could pop. I mean, we see it every summer. So I think this next month will be pretty busy for him.
He is Shea Dixon on 3, the Bengal Tiger. Always a pleasure, Shea. Thanks for the time, man.
Absolutely. Anytime, Matt.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.